Welcome back. So today we're just going to pick up where we left off. But before that, a brief summary of what we did last time. We discussed how living organisms are made out of carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen. 99% of them are made out of this, and the remaining 1% is all the other elements. And the interaction of these elements and the breakdown formation of different molecules such as water, protein, carbohydrates is what gives biology its properties. So metabolism is where all these different biological compounds they interact, all the reactions happening in our cells, in our living organisms, and there are two halves to it. There's the anabolism and catabolism, where anabolism is formation of large molecules from smaller units, and catabolism is the breakdown of large molecules from smaller units. And the reactions that are responsible for these two halves of metabolism are condensation reaction for the anabolism and hydrolysis reaction for catabolism. And one thing we said was that these two halves of metabolism, they're constantly transferring energy between one another, because while one is using energy to make something, the other one is releasing energy to break something. So this constant energy transfer that's happening, and we discussed that this is done through ATP. But how exactly does that happen? Well, that we were in the process of, but before we get into ATP, we wanted to discuss the properties of water, because they're very fundamental to understanding all the different interactions happening in our body, because water makes up like 65% of ourselves, and then also like 80% of the cell contents are usually like water anyways. So understanding water is important, and it kind of comes off the back of water being a polar compound, where basically the electrons are not equally shared, and so oxygen has a partial negative and hydrogen has a partial positive, and this gives rise to different properties such as hydrogen bonding, and strong intramolecular forces like the covalent bonds between oxygen and hydrogen, and how that allows us to dissolve polar. So polar meaning something that has charges on it. Polar solutes in water, and so that makes it a good medium of transport. And we discussed how that is, and we discussed the specific heat capacity of water, where the energy required to raise 1 degree of 1 kg of water is quite high, and that means that our bodies remain stable, have a stable environment, because if, let's say, by changing the outside temperature by 2 degrees, our internal body temperature does not stay at what it's supposed to, 37 degrees. It's going to cause a lot of problems for our proteins and our cells, because they're not going to be able to work better. So water has to be resistant to these constant fluctuations in temperature, and that's water has the highest specific heat capacity of any known substance, I believe, but double check me on that. And we were discussing how specific latent heat of evaporation or vaporization, how you call it, is also an important property of water, and that also comes from the fact that these hydrogen bonds are forming between water, and breaking these hydrogen bonds is vastly easier than it is to break these covalent bonds between oxygen and hydrogen. And so you only need around I would say 40 kilojoules of energy per mole to break these bonds. And why this is important is, like, if you have a living system and it's hot outside, the water droplets on your skin, on your surface, they will absorb the heat, excess heat from your skin or your surface, use that to break these bonds, and when you break these bonds, they will become gaseous, evaporate, and when they evaporate, what are they essentially doing? Heat is being transferred, energy is being transferred from you to these water molecules, and then they're becoming gas, H2O, right? So that is creating this, it kind of like sucking out all this excess heat out of you, and so it creates a cooling effect. So all these things are kind of interrelated to one another, and that all stems from the key principle uh, in water molecules, which is oxygen is more greedy when it's sharing electrons. So electrons are kind of like close to oxygen. I'm drawing them as two dots. And that creates this partial negative charge on oxygen and partial positive charges on hydrogen. And this allows, hydrogen bonding to happen, for water to dissolve solutes, etc., etc. So we're going to pick up from here, and we're going to introduce some other key properties of water. The first one we're going to look at is, so did I number this? Okay, yeah. The first one we're going to look at is cohesion and surface tension. So water molecules, we've explained this, because there's so many of them, right? And all of them are polar. And what does polar really mean? Polar really means that, that they have positive and negative charges. And when you have positive and negative charges, what's really happening is the creation of these bonds, right? The creation of these hydrogen bonds. The creation of these hydrogen bonds that is happening between the oxygen and hydrogen, right? So these intermolecular forces, they're weak, right? Because I explained earlier that you don't need that much energy to break these ones down. You need a lot of energy to break this bond, but not that much energy to break this bond. And these intermolecular forces, these weak intermolecular forces, they're very important because they give a lot of properties to water. One of which we've already discussed, latent heat of vaporization. And we've also discussed specific heat capacity of water, right? So these are important properties. But what else does it give rise to? Interesting. There's yet another property of water. So imagine this is let's say a box, right? Let's say a tank, and you fill it up with water. Now this is the surface of your water. Okay, now imagine I'm just going to draw one big circle that donates a water molecule. So these are water molecules. Remember that deep down they're actually OH and H. Okay. Now water molecules are everywhere in this tank, correct? They're everywhere. And because of these intermolecular forces, they're being constantly attracted to each other. And one thing you'll notice immediately from this is that because they all exist in this form, they're being constantly attracted to water molecules to its side. So let's say this is a water molecule. It will be attracted to a water molecule to its left. It will be attracted to a water molecule to its right. It will be attracted to a water molecule above it. It will be attracted to a water molecule below it. And you can fill in these spots as well if you want to, but let's keep it simple. Let's keep it like, so it's being attracted in these four directions: water molecule to its side, water molecules on top, water molecules on below. And this attraction is backwards and forwards, right? Like the one is attracted here, the other one is attracted there. But if I draw it only from the perspective of one water molecule, right? So it is being attracted on this side. It's being attracted on this side, it's being attracted on this side, it's being attracted on this side. So you could say that the net force pulling this water molecule would be zero, right? But what's happening to the water molecules on the surface? Because these cancel each other out, right? What's happening to the water molecules on the surface? Well, on the surface, you see that the water molecule is being attracted to the water molecule to its left, being attracted to the water molecule to its right, being attracted to the water molecule down, but there's no water molecule on top. What's on top? Just air. So what do we see? We see that this cancels this, but what is canceling this? Nothing. And so this creates a downward force on all these water molecules that are on the top. And water cohesion is a property that means water likes to stick to itself. Correct? So what happens is that the water molecules on top, they try to stick to each other as much as they can, but they're all being constantly pulled down. Pulled down where? Pulled down to the interior of the water body or fluid. Right? And you've observed this phenomena in real life. Because what you see form is two things. One, this invisible elastic sheet that you see on top of the liquid surface. Well, you don't see it. This is an invisible elastic sheet. And it kind of allows water to have a very high surface tension. The other thing you'll see is, let's say I put a small water droplet on a surface. Let's say I put a water droplet on the surface. You've always seen that the water droplet forms a sphere. Why is that? Well, if we zoom in and explain through the property that we just discussed, we see that the water molecules on the surface of this, so just zooming in right now, they're being pulled to the side, but because there's air on this side and no water, they're being attracted to where there is water, which is inwards. And this goes in line with what I just said, that the water molecules on the surface are constantly being pulled down to the interior of the water. Because they don't have any water molecules to interact with outside. Correct? And so this gives water this spherical shape that we see. Right? It gives it the spherical shape. And this creates a very tiny, thin, invisible elastic layer on top of the water surface, which gives water its surface tension. Now, you can ask me something like, sir, if water is constantly being pulled down, then why doesn't all it just get pulled down, right? Why doesn't water just go sink in on itself? Like, this is water, and why doesn't it just go like that? Like, what if it's being constantly pulled down, right? That's a very interesting question to ask, but think about it. Because there is a constant downward force on the water molecules at the top, they're constantly applying force on the water molecules at the bottom. And so because they're applying constant force on the water molecules at the bottom, they're also applying constant force on the water molecules at the top. And this internal pressure from the fluid cancels out this downward pull from the water molecules at the top. And so this is basically why we don't see water sinking in. But an interesting thing happens. Because water has this surface tension, you might have seen a leaf floating on the surface of water, or an insect standing on the surface of water. how is an insect standing? How is a leaf standing? When an insect stands, the water molecules, they're pulled like this. It creates like this dimple. And so already there's this downward force that the surface molecules are facing, and now there's the mass of the insect on it, right? And what's happening is, because this disrupts this equilibrium that I just discussed over here, right? There is all the molecules here, they try to pull together sideways, and they pull up on this, the surface tension that is created because the water molecules are all joined at the top, because they're all being pulled down constantly. So what they try to do is they try to stick to one another as close as they can. And so they're more concentrated on the top because they're all being pulled down. And so because water likes to be with itself, right? And why does it like to be with itself? Because of this. Because of this. This is basically cohesion. Water molecules sticking or being attracted to themselves, right? And so because this is happening over here, because water molecules are constantly attracted to each other, and because that the water molecules on the surface don't have any water molecules on top of them, and they want to be together, so they try to pull in as many water molecules to its sides as much as it can, and that's what leads to this layer being formed, right? This concentrated layer that's constantly being pulled down, that creates surface tension for water. And we see, because of the surface tension, they're constantly being pulled to the interior of the fluid, and that's what makes a spherical water droplet that you see, right? Because they're being pulled into the center. And when an insect stands on it, it tries to disrupt this equilibrium that is formed between the water molecules at the surface constantly being pulled down, and then fluid pressure, the internal fluid pressure pulling it upwards. It disrupts it, and so you get this upward force being applied, not only from the disruption of the water molecule, but also from the buoyancy, right? And so you see them float on top, basically. You see a leaf float. You see an insect stand, because it distributes its weight across a larger area, right? And because it distributes its weight across a larger area, the force downward that it's applying isn't as big to disrupt this delicate interaction between these water molecules on the surface. This, ladies and gentlemen, is cohesion. The ability of water molecules to stick to one another. And that's possible because of these partial negative, partial positive charges that we discussed previously. But now we're talking about, okay, another byproduct of these intermolecular forces, which is the surface tension and cohesion. Right? The last property of water that we want to touch is adhesion. So you learned cohesion, and you saw how cohesion allows water to stick to one. Cohesion is the property of water to stick to themselves, and creates surface tension, which allows things to float or stand on water, right? Okay, so now we're going to go into adhesion, another property of water. What exactly is adhesion, and where does it come from? Well, remember this really well, water is constantly being attracted to other water molecules, correct? But why is it being attracted to other water molecules? We know this because of the partial positive and partial negative charges. So you can ask me, okay, sir, but what if there's something like X partial positive, Y partial negative? Will water be attracted to this as well? The answer is yes. And this is the fundamentals of what we discussed when we were talking about solvent. Water is a good solvent for polar molecules. Polar molecules have charges on them. Either they're partial charges, which I drew over here, X and Y, or they're full charges, like, A positive and C negative, let's say. water will attract to them because positive is attracted to negative. That is a very simple concept, correct? So adhesion is because, again, is another property of water derived from the fact that water is polar and has charges on it. And what exactly is adhesion? Think about it like this. Think about a surface. Think about the surface of a glass. Glass is made out of silica oxide, correct? So imagine you have silica, oxygen, silica, oxygen, silica, oxygen, silica, oxygen, right? Silica will have a partial positive charge. Oxygen will have a partial negative charge. Silica will have partial positive and oxygen partial negative. Same reason apply. It's because oxygen is more electronegative. It's greedy, will keep the electrons to itself. Now imagine I put a water molecule on top. Will it still form a spherical bead? The answer is no, it will not. And the reason for that is when you have water come in contact, which is like this, come in contact with something that has charges on it, oops, the negative of this oxygen is going to be attracted to this positive of the silica. The positive of this hydrogen is going to be attracted to the negative of the oxygen. Right? And so what happens is when I put a water droplet on a surface that's polar, water won't form a bead that we see, unless it's a very small water droplet, and then it potentially will form a bead. But effectively, water will spread. Right? Water molecules will spread. Why are they spreading? They're spreading because there are charges everywhere. So there is a water molecule over here. You place it on top. It will effectively go like that. Spreads. Why is it spreading? Because if you zoom in and you look at what's actually happening to the charges, you will see that the oxygen is partial negative, partial positive hydrogens. The partial negative is going to want to be attracted to the partial positive of the silica, and the partial positive of the hydrogen is going to want to be attracted to the partial negative of the oxygen, right? That's what you see. So you see water spread. So what exactly is that adhesion then? Adhesion is the ability of water to stick or be attracted to polar surfaces. Right? So one is the ability of water to stick to some polar surface, and the other is the ability of water to stick to itself. And all of this leads to, like, byproducts of other important functionalities. So what is that? What do I mean by that? So cohesion, I told you about, is important for like keeping things afloat. Giving things surface tension. What is adhesion important to? Now think about it like this: in plants, the water is going from the roots to the leaves. Right? It's going from the roots to the leaves. It's going up a xylem vessel, right? It's going up the xylem. Now, if water to go up, it's not only using both adhesion and cohesion. It's not only just using adhesion, but it's also using cohesion. How? So this is let's say a xylem vessel. Right? Water is effectively working against gravity. If you're going up, you're working against gravity, correct? You're working against gravity. Gravity is pulling you down, and this water is going upwards. How is water going upwards? One, it's attracted, the water molecules, they're attracted to the surface of this vessel because of this phenomenon that I just discussed, adhesion. Two, the water molecules are attracted to themselves. So they're constantly being pulled up, right? I mean, they're being pulled up because of transpirational pull, because it creates like a negative pressure, and that allows water to go up. But what allows it to go up the tube is in a continuous, unbroken stream, is adhesion, the property of adhesion, and cohesion. Because imagine the surfaces of xylem didn't allow water to stick to them. Then you will basically have something like this, right? Water column. Water doesn't stick to it, so there's this gap between it. There's this gap between it. Will water be able to stay upright like that? Like we see over here? Will water stay like this? Have you ever seen a strand of water like that in mid-air if it's not touching anything? No, of course not. So this property of adhesion is what allows water to go through pipes. What allows water to go through vessels. You can think of your blood vessels. You can think of your xylem in plants. Very important to a lot of these things. So this kind of ends our discussion of the properties of water and how all of them come from the fact that water is just a polar molecule with charges on it, right? The cohesion, the surface tension, the adhesion, the latent heat of vaporization, the specific heat capacity, being a solvent and a transport medium. And we started this conversation because I wanted to discuss with you guys ATP, right? Now, the reason I wanted to discuss ATP is because of metabolism. I told you metabolism has anabolism and catabolism, and that and both of them use energy, and ATP is what allows this energy transfer between these two halves of metabolism. Correct? But how does ATP actually do this? And the reason we touched on water is important for how ATP actually does this. So ATP is basically a molecule which has a sugar part called ribose. And don't worry, you will learn what these are in a bit. It has a adenine, which is a nucleotide, which you will learn what it is in a bit. Well, it's not a nucleotide, it's a base, nitrogenous base that is on a nucleotide. And then the important part is that it has 3 phosphate groups. So, first thing to note is ATP, right, has these 3 phosphate groups, and these phosphate groups have charges on them. This is a phosphate group. What do I mean by charges? Okay, so, what do I mean by charges? Look at this oxygen. This oxygen has only formed 1 bond. You know from your O-level days that oxygen forms 2 bonds, right? So if I have an oxygen that forms only 1 bond with something, that means there's still an electron over here that is unbounded. This electron will say, let's say it gives it a negative charge. So we see that there's negative charges on the oxygens that have only formed 1 bond, right? Now, these negative charges interact with positive charges, correct? Now, what happens in ATP is that ATP gets broken down. Oh, actually, yeah, gets broken down over here. which means that this phosphate is removed from ATP. What does ATP stand for? Adenosine, which is this group, triphosphate. Tri meaning 3, phosphate meaning phosphates. So 3 phosphates. So this is 1, 2, and 3. Correct? Now, when ATP is broken down, it removes one of these phosphate groups. So you'll have P double bond O, 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 and something. And then you have this. The remaining part of the structure doesn't change. This doesn't change. But this did. This part did. Right? This part changed. Now, how exactly did this happen? We broke this bond. We targeted this bond. This one. We broke this bond. We broke it. Now, everyone has probably mentioned this to you, your teachers, whatever, in O-levels biology, that breaking down ATP releases energy. Releases energy. But the smart kids amongst you will tell me, sir, but breaking bonds requires energy, does it not? And you are right. Breaking bonds does require energy. So when we were breaking this bond, we did use energy. But the net effect of breaking that bond results in releasing energy. So while the first part is an endogornic reaction, where we used energy to break this bond. The second one is an exogornic reaction. What is the second reaction that's happening? Okay, let's take a look, guys. So this phosphate has negative and negative charges over here. Correct? By the way, I'm going to write X here because this phosphate forms a bond with something, which I'll explain in a bit. And now this phosphate has negative charges, negative, negative. I have water molecules floating around. Water molecules are partially charged. What I see is this partial positive of hydrogen is attracted to this negative of oxygen. What I see is this partial positive of hydrogen is attracted to this oxygen. Similarly, there's water molecules floating around on the other side as well. And they also have their partial charges. And so this is attracted here, this is attracted here, and so on and so forth. So what you see is, because these bonds are forming, and bond formation releases energy, you know this, then what happened? We used a little bit of energy to break this bond, but we released a lot more energy by the creation of these bonds. Correct? So the net effect, if I use, let's say, -10 to break the bond, and then I created, let's say I used 10 kilojoules of energy to break the bond, right? It's just hypothetical, it's not real. But in reality, right, let's say I used 10 kilojoules to break the bond, and I ended up getting 40.5 kilojoules of energy while I made these bonds, then the net energy is negative 30.5 kilojoules. This is the energy released from breaking this bond. It's not directly from breaking this bond, it's a byproduct of breaking this bond. It's the rolling effect of breaking this ball. It's the snowball effect of breaking this bond. Correct? And so that is the case. 30.5 kilojoules of energy is released when you break this bond and this bond. When you break this bond, it's slightly higher, and every time you remove a phosphate from ATP, so ATP, triphosphate, then you break another bond, and you make ADP, which is diphosphate, adenosine diphosphate, and then you break another bond, so you break this bond as well, right? This bond as well, and now you get AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate. It's just removing a phosphate group every time. Every time it's removing a phosphate group. So what is this? Is this anabolism? Or is this catabolism? I'm going from a big structure to a smaller structure. ATP, triphosphate, then diphosphate, then monophosphate. So it has to be catabolism. Remember, I told you katna, for those that remember, for those that know Urdu or Hindi, katna means cutting, right? So you're breaking it down. And every time you break it down, you undergo a specific type of reaction called hydrolysis reaction. Hydro, water. Lysis, breakdown. So you're breaking down something in the presence of water. Now let me explain to you what hydrolysis is and how that relates to ATP over here. You are undergoing catabolism, but you're specifically doing hydrolysis. The reaction is called hydrolysis. To understand hydrolysis, imagine this. Or actually, to understand hydrolysis, let's first look at the opposite of hydrolysis, which is condensation reaction, which is the reaction that is happening in anabolism, where you're making a large unit from smaller units. Now, how does condensation reaction take place? Okay, ladies and gents, it's very easy. So let's say you have a small molecule over here. Let's say it has an OH group on this side. Let's say you have another molecule over here, and it has an OH group on this side. We know that OH is a hydroxyl group. When these two come together, what happens is the OH from one group and the hydrogen from another group, they will join and they will be released as water molecules. So you end up getting this structure. So condensation reaction, this is condensation. So condensation reaction is when two molecules come together, two small molecules come together and release H2O in the process. Because this H and this OH will form water. And this water will have partial charges on it. The same water. And this is now a bigger structure. Correct? This is effectively anabolism. The reaction in particular we're talking about is condensation reaction. Now the opposite of this is hydrolysis reaction. What is happening in hydrolysis reaction? We take this structure and we break it with the addition of what? Water. Why water? Well, you see, water was removed from this structure to make this big structure. So water was removed from these tiny units to make this big structure. So to go back to these tiny units, I just need to add water back in. And so H, OH, and H. So one of these OHs will go on this side and the other hydrogen will go back to its original place. So you end up getting this. Perfect. This is hydrolysis, where you added water and you restored the original units. You broke this down. You broke these bonds down. And you recreated the original subunit that led to the creation of this larger molecule or structure. Basically, one is the inverse of another. Where water left in anabolism, you reintroduced water and you restored the original subunits. Now, how does this apply in the context of ATP? Remember, I told you I wrote an X here. This X is important. We're coming back to it right now. So, you have sugar, you have adenine, and then you have your phosphate groups. Right? Now, when I introduce water into this equation to break this bond, so the reaction that's breaking this bond is hydrolysis, I'm introducing water, right? What is happening? The OH from one, so the water molecule is what? OH, right? So this OH, it will form a bond with the phosphate that we are removing from the equation. So P double bond O, O, actually let me do this in white. P double bond O, O, O. This phosphate needs to form 4 bonds. We know this from our O-level chemistry. So the O and the H from this water molecule will go and form this bond. Keep in mind this is still negative. And on the other side, we get P double bond O, 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 P double bond O, 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 and then the rest of the ADP molecule, which is sugar and adenine. Right? The rest of it's there. Sir, what happens to the water molecule? If OH goes here, what happens to this H? This H stays as what? Positive. Just a positive charge. This positive charge can either interact with this or it can interact with other water molecules that have what? Negative charges on them, partial negative charges on them. Da-da-da-da-da or da-da-da-da-da. One of these. Correct? What did we do? We added water. What is this reaction called? Hydrolysis. What is hydrolysis part of? Catabolism. What if I was making ATP, I was making this, from this, I would have the OH being removed on this side, and the P forming a bond here. When the OH is removed, it will find this hydrogen ion and make water molecule again. H2O. And that would be condensation reaction, which would be part of anabolism. Anabolism. Okay, so this brings me to the conclusion on this topic, because we have now gone through metabolism, introduced catabolism and anabolism, spoke briefly about what reaction is happening in catabolism, hydrolysis, which means water is used to break bonds, and anabolism, where water is released while making bonds. And then we also talked about ATP, because when these reactions are happening, catabolism and anabolism, energy is being released or used. So when energy is being released or used, what do we need to interact with these two? ATP. And we discussed how ATP carries this energy. It carries the energy through forming bonds with the other phosphate groups on ATP triphosphate. And when you break these bonds, even though initially you are applying a small amount of energy to break the bonds, the net result is you release energy. And so that energy that, let's say, you are forming through anabolism, that energy, that free energy that gets released when you make a large molecule, that energy is used to make ATP molecules. And when you need the energy to break down, in catabolism, need the energy to break down stuff, ATP comes back and then it releases the energy by breaking down its own molecules. And the net effect of breaking down its own molecules is an exogornic reaction, and that energy is then used to break down something that is big into something that's small in catabolism. So ATP is connecting anabolism and catabolism, and ATP is only able to do this because of the properties of water, right? Because when ATP uses energy to break itself down, you would say that, oh, it used energy, but then it needs to release energy to help the catabolism of some big structure. Let's say that big structure is, starch. It wants to break down starch, but you need energy to do that. ATP is like, don't worry, I will sacrifice my life for breaking down the starch. So I will break one of my bonds, use very little energy, but because there's water molecules floating around, I'll form more bonds with them, and that will release energy, and that energy you can use to break down starch. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why biology is so cool. Because everything is connected. Everything is connected. Everything comes from atoms, elements, and charges, and the interaction of these charges, and how these charges and these atoms and molecules, they create structures, and how these structures then have different functions. And so this is why I think that A-levels is a good step that you could use to kind of explore how interdisciplinary biology can be, instead of thinking about it in a very one-dimensional way. So this is the end of our demo classes. Classes will begin from Saturday, and we will start with carbohydrates, and then go into carbohydrates and proteins and lipids and all the other big biological molecules. Because remember, from the very first sentence that I wrote, or from one of the first sentence I wrote, I said cells, we have water, we have protein, we have carbohydrates and fats. So we've discussed water, and we've explained why water is so fundamentally important to everything, and how it's important, and why it's so important to metabolism, and why it's because it helps ATP. And the reason water even has its own properties is because of this. And this creates its ability to dissolve things. It creates its ability to have a stable environment because of high specific heat capacity. It creates the ability of water to create a cooling effect by breaking down these intermolecular forces, which are easier to break than this intramolecular force. It allows water to have cohesion, which is the ability of water to stick to itself, and that creates surface tension, which allows things to float on it, right? It's like this thin elastic sheet that we see. And we also, well, it's one of the things that help things float. So like buoyancy is one, and then surface tension is another. And then it also, this water molecules that form a bead because of this internal pull and so that is a very good example of cohesion and how you can visualize cohesion in your daily life. And then we spoke about adhesion, how water molecule sticks and spreads out to other polar surfaces, and that is important for what? For bringing things water. If there was no adhesion happening here, there would be air and a gap, and then so how can you expect water to just kind of stick in a stream? What is this, magic? No, it's not. Well, it is kind of magic, it's science, but you can't just do it without if there's no interaction here. And so and we talked about how ATP is so important, and the basics of what a condensation and a hydrolysis reaction is, and how that relates to ATP and its interaction with water. And I hope all of this is connected in your heads and is creating links. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.